If Julian's still here, I want to tell him that I think he's awesome and we love him. So every morning during the course of my day, on my way to work or throughout the day, I'm going to drive past Facebook, Google, maybe Microsoft, almost always Hewlett-Packard, oftentimes Apple, some of the biggest technology companies in the world. They're headquartered in my neighborhood, within a few miles of where I live and work. In biotech, I might come across some of the largest biotech companies. Genentech is right down the road. For those of you who have been there, you know that. Solyndra is right across the bay. Some of the biggest clean tech companies. It's a huge market. It's a huge market for anybody in almost any business, but particularly those of you that are in the IT business. Not too far from where I work is Stanford University, well known as a brain trust. And I can't tell you how many times that I've had clients who started out their business in a dorm room at Stanford University and went on to be very successful companies. The most striking thing about the Silicon Valley, however, is how international it has become. I mean, just listening to this panel, this excellent panel that preceded me, I could get a sense of just how international it was and how relatively easily a company from outside the US can be a startup company in the Silicon Valley and in the Bay Area. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is some of the legal strategy that you might think about as you enter the Valley. Because I think that if you're here, the fact that you're here tells me that you may be interested in expanding your business. It's in gaining access to new markets and increasing the opportunities that you have for your business. And I think for the next 45 minutes as I speak, more and more you may begin to understand how important legal strategy is. And perhaps when you do make that move to the United States and you do come into that market and enter that market, and you may seek advisors to hire, I think that legal strategy will be one of the most important things that you want to consider before you even get to the US. So, I think of legal issues as really coming down to three things. Legal and business issues. It comes down to three things. I think a great startup company really needs three things. It has to have, as we heard earlier, it's got to have great technology. Absolutely. It's got to have people, great people. And it needs funding. And that's why people come to the United States. So let me just start with a strategy. Let me just start with a basic sort of legal strategy, and we're going to work from here. Just big picture. This is how I oftentimes see it. This is a very commonly used idea. So we have a Slovenian hair company wanting to establish a presence in the US. And we'll talk about how we might do that in a minute. But the very first thing we're going to do is organize a US presence, either as a company or as a branch or something else, whatever it is. It's probably going to be a company. So let's assume we form a US corporation. Now, remember what I said, we're going to the Silicon Valley because we want access to markets. We may also want access to the VC funds or other funding opportunities. So, we don't know for sure, because this is a very international community, whether that funding source really is going to be American or not. But if it is US, a US investor will typically not want to invest in a foreign company. Not always, but typically they will not want to invest in a foreign company. They want to invest in a US company. On the other hand, you really don't know. You don't know how it's going to go. You don't know if you're going to be able to break into that market or not. You don't know if you're going to attract US investment. You don't really know if you're going to be able to attract and retain the best people. So the problem with setting up the structure on your left with the US company on top is that that subjects everything that you have worldwide eventually to US tax. So it's not something you would do unless you absolutely had to. In other words, unless you had a US investor. Because remember what I said, a US investor is going to want you to do this structure. Now, I started out my career as a tax lawyer. And this is a very inefficient tax structure. But I have found that in the Silicon Valley, we tax lawyers have to fall on our swords a lot. Because that's just what the investment community demands. Okay? So that's the structure we'll use if we have to have a US investor. On the other hand, if it turns out that our investor happens to be foreign. And by the way, the very largest venture fund on Sand Hill Road right now is a Russian sovereign fund. So it could very well be foreign money, even if you're in Silicon Valley, that goes into your entity. And it may very well that the non-US investor, they don't care if you're a Delaware corporation. In fact, they'd rather that you're not. Well, in that case, we're going to keep this structure on the right. Why would we do that? Because we can keep the technology, which is very important, outside US and outside US taxing jurisdiction. So we start off with the structure on the right, and if it turns out we do get a US investor, then we do what I call a flip. We just flip the companies, we invert them. And I won't bore you with the gory details of how that happens legally. Suffice it to say, it's a relatively simple, straightforward transaction we do regularly. That's the basic idea. We just flip them. It's a wait-and-see strategy for going into the US. Now, as simple as that is, it's the kind of thing that is not really intuitive. Not something you might think about otherwise if you had not planned into it. And that's why I want to mention it now, just to start things off. So let's talk about, I say there's three major considerations. I have a spider up here on the wall, giving you kind of these subsidiary concerns that I'm going to touch on, but they all relate to my three considerations. We have tax issues. Taxes, one of my character flaws is that I am a tax lawyer, so I am going to talk a little bit about tax. We've got employment issues that we can deal with up front. Liability protection is always a primary consideration when you go into any country. And intellectual property protection, of course, is important. So just taking a step back, the way to think about the U.S. is that sometimes it's a little bit difficult to understand from outside the United States because it's somewhat schizophrenic. It's somewhat two-faced, right? We've got competing policies and competing concerns. On the one hand, there is a policy of open competition. There's a policy of freedom of contract. The idea that people should be allowed to do whatever they want to do, free of restriction and free of unnecessary regulation. And if you think about it, what defines a startup company better than that? It really is, in a way, a profound act of personal rebellion for somebody to leave a large company and go out and, like you say, sell their car, mortgage their home, bet everything on an idea that they have, right? And of course, the U.S. allows that and encourages that. Think of Las Vegas. Contrast that, however, with there are certain protections that this open competition idea sometimes runs up against. One, of course, is consumer protection. Those of you that are in a B2C business will probably have to deal with this, consumer protection issues. There is also fairly strong employee protections. Nothing like you have here in Europe, I will tell you, but there are some somewhat surprising legal laws protecting the rights of employees. And finally, the other dichotomy or dual system that sometimes gives people a little bit of trouble is the idea that we have a federal government and 50 state governments, at least, plus cities and counties. And a legal question is never just one question. It's never just a federal issue. It's a federal and a state issue. If you're selling securities in the United States, you're not only dealing with federal securities law, you're dealing with state law as well. So that sometimes surprises people to find out that they might do everything that's required under federal law, but still not be in compliance with law because there is a state that they have not complied with. So keep that in mind. And it works the other way as well. I have an extra mic on? Yeah. Walk over here. Is that better?
No.
It's his fault. Where was I? It works the other way as well. For example, you may have heard I had some involvement in, there was California had proposed to legalize marijuana recently, and there was a lot of debate about that. And the debate came down to the fact that even though there were ballots on there were measures on the ballot for the legalization of marijuana in California, and some states had actually gone and legalized it, it was still a violation of federal law. So there were